I am a Yank in Sussex. One of my current projects is a documentary about the River Adur. For most projects, I like to get drone footage of my subjects, if it's applicable, and so in aid of this, I decided to take my DJI Mini 2 out to the village of Ashurst in West Sussex and walk it over to the bank of the river nearby. What I was specifically trying to do on that day was to fly the drone up to where the western and eastern Adurs come together. This confluence is called the Fork, appropriately enough. So it being a quiet Monday on the occasion of the bank holiday of Pentecost, I drove to Ashurst in the late afternoon. Nothing was happening there, which suited me just fine. Of course, Ashurst is quiet most of the time anyway. Before I tell you about my attempts to get drone footage of the river near this lovely village, let me tell you about the village itself. After my initial foray, during 2 other days I went back to gather additional images and videos, as well as to speak with the owners of the village inn. Like many other villages, towns, and cities in the English-speaking world, there are a number of other settlements named Ashurst. There are a total of 4 in England, and 1 each in Arizona in the United States and in New Zealand. There is also a town of Ashurst Wood in West Sussex, located about 20 miles northeast of Ashurst. Followers of this channel know how I enjoy delving into the meanings of place names and their origins, so it should be no surprise that I'm going to talk about the origin of the village name. Ashurst is actually 2 words combined into one, ash and hurst, with the 2 H's combined into one, I guess to save space. The ash part refers to the tree called by that name. The name traces back to the Old English word ash, which relates to the Proto-Indo-European name of the tree. The word was also used to mean spear in that language, because ash wood is good for spear shafts. Interestingly, the same characteristics that make ash good for spears also makes it good for baseball bats. Now, I would have thought that the cricket bats would also be made from ash too, but it turns out that those are traditionally made from willow. Hurst is an Old English word meaning wooded hillock, and is a very common syllable in English place names. So basically, the name Ashurst is a place name that means wooded heights where ash trees grow. Clearly, there could be many such places, so it's easy to see why there would be 5 places in England with that name. The name suggests that there would be ash trees nearby, and indeed, there were a few fine specimens there when I visited. This pair, which grows on a private lot opposite the village hall, are very healthy trees, near the maximum height that ash trees grow. At first one sees 1 tree, but upon closer inspection one sees that they are actually 2 trees growing on each side of the driveway into the property. Ashurst has a population of 279 as of the 2011 census. This makes it a very small village. It has a Church of England primary school, a church dedicated to St. James, and 1 pub, the Fountain Inn. Like many other English country inns and pubs, the Fountain Inn has a long history. According to Wikipedia, the first inn in the parish was located not directly in Ashurst, but a bit south of there near Horsebridge Common. The site of the original building seems to be unknown. Over time in that location it was known by at least 3 names, the last of which was the Fountain. By 1788, the inn had moved to a timber-framed, partly tile-hung farmhouse in the center of Ashurst village, opposite the village pond, which no longer exists. For a time, the inn operated under the name Red Lion, but by 1830 it had adopted the name it is known by today, which is the Fountain Inn, harking back to its old name. I spoke with Alex, who with his wife Lindsay owns and operates the inn today, and he told me that the inn was founded in 1651. He said that sometimes guests ask why the Fountain Inn has that name, even though there is no fountain on the premises. The answer is that in olden times many people were illiterate, and when traveling in need of a place to sleep and eat, would be advised to look for a building under the sign of, for example, the Red Lion or the Fountain. If one were to expect a fountain to exist at an inn named the Fountain, then one would have to expect there to be a red lion caged somewhere on the premises of an inn with that name. It's a lovely and friendly public house, and it has a couple of claims to fame. In 1979, former Beatle Paul McCartney and his band Wings filmed the music video for their song Wonderful Christmas Time at the fountain. Sir Paul was a frequent visitor at the inn.
Simply having a wonderful Christmas time.
Another person of comparable notoriety was the famous actor Sir Laurence Olivier. He and his wife lived in a home nearby, and Sir Laurence liked to spend evenings at the Fountain Inn. He had a favorite table in the corner of the front room of the inn. After his passing in 1989, the inn placed a portrait of him in that corner, and his favorite table is a frequent request of visitors. Alex, the inn's owner, told me that Sir Lawrence's widow still lives outside the village in their old home, the Malt House. Besides Sir Laurence Olivier, another former resident was the English Christian writer Margaret Fairless Barber, who wrote under the pseudonym Michael Fairless. She lived from 1869 to 1901 and is buried in the village churchyard. Her book of meditations, The Road Member, which was published in 1902, after her death, was a popular classic of the early 20th century and is still available from various publishers. Here's a passage from The Road Mender, read by my British bride.
I have attained my ideal. I am a road mender, some say a stone breaker. Both titles are correct, but the one is more pregnant than the other. All day I sit by the roadside on a stretch of grass under a high hedge of saplings and a tangle of traveller's joy, woodbine, sweetbriar and late roses. Opposite me is a white gate, seldom used, if one may judge by the trail of honeysuckle growing tranquilly along it. I know now that whenever I die, my soul will pass out through this white gate, and then, thank God, I shall not have need to undo that trail.
If that passage sounds melancholy, remember that it was written by a young woman whose health was never very good, and whose condition so worsened over time that she had to be cared for full-time during her closing years. She had wanted to live a life of service, but ended up having to be served by others, passing away at the young age of 31. Her grave marker gives her name as Margaret Fairless Dowson, instead of her birth name, Barber, in honor of the Dowson family who cared for her during her last years. The village church is not on the main drag, but is a bit further afield than the B2135 road that passes through the village. After a very quiet and picturesque drive, there I was. The church is dedicated to St. James, but since there are 5 saints called James, venerated by the Church of England, I wasn't sure which one was meant. But in an email exchange with the rector of St. James Church, who is also the vicar of Stenning's St. Cushman and St. Andrew Church, he graciously provided the information that that dedicatee was St. James the Great, one of the sons of Zebedee in the New Testament. You can see the saint illustrated in one of the stained glasses in the church. Here he is with a pilgrim's staff, hat, and scallop shell. The scallop shell is the traditional emblem of St. James. Alongside him in the stained glass is St. George, the patron saint of England, and you can see under his feet the remains of the dragon that he slew. There is evidence of a church in this location since the early 1100s, but the oldest existing part of the church was built in 1170. Over the centuries, the building was expanded and improved upon, evolving from a single nave structure to what is now a somewhat complex design with both a nave and an aisle. The last major restructuring occurred in 1877, and the current set of pews date from that time. The current organ was installed in 1910. On the walls there are a number of dedications to various former officials and parishioners of the church. The funeral of Sir Laurence Olivier, which was held here in 1989, is commemorated in this choir vestry, which was a gift from his family in his name. One curious exhibit in the church is this vamping horn. It hangs in a case on the wall facing the entrance. I had never heard the term vamping horn before. According to sources, it is a form of keyless trumpet, and this one dates from 1770. What was it used for? It is said that vamping horns were used to call people to prayer. Another source claimed that they were used to give the note to the musicians and singers. To me at least, this seems unlikely. In any case, this one is a replica of the original, which is now in the Stenning Museum. I had a look at the churchyard, where many former parishioners are buried. The burials here go back to the 1700s, though there are a few much more recent. I mentioned earlier that this churchyard has the resting place of the writer Margaret Fairless Barber, as you can see from her wooden grave marker. Here, near the church's main gate, is a memorial to the men of the village who were killed in the Great War, also known as World War I. Once I was done at the church, I moved on to my original purpose of visiting Ashurst. I parked up at the village hall parking area and then headed off to the river on foot. I followed the standard public walkway signs. The walkway distance from the parking area to the footbridge, which crossed the river, was just 7/10 of a mile. But due to a post-Christmas illness the British bride and I had both suffered, my physical endurance had gotten quite low. So it was a rather taxing bit of exercise, but well worth it, both for the opportunity of flying the drone along the river and definitely for the beautiful country gamble. There were lovely fields of new-growth crops and some very impressive trees on the path, a majestic oak and a pair of ash trees. The wind hadn't been particularly strong along the way, but once I reached the river it had picked up considerably. At first I thought this was due to a general increase in the wind, but later I realized that it had to do with the channeling effect of the river valley. Of course, the valley at this point isn't particularly deep or dramatic, but it does seem to do the job. Once I finished what I was doing and headed back, it seemed that the wind diminished in strength. Of course, that was because I left the valley effect. So I put the drone up, first doing a 360-degree panorama, and then I headed downstream so that I could fly upstream, that being the focus of the exercise. The reason for choosing this particular spot to fly from was because of it being a bit downstream from the fork, where the eastern and western Adurs come together. Here's some borrowed footage of the fork from Stuart Spicer's YouTube channel. My plan was to fly from the footbridge here upstream to the fork, but while flying downstream was easy enough, flying upstream was a different and more difficult matter. I initially put the drone up about 55 meters high, but it was reporting too much wind, so I had to drop it to 40. At that relatively low altitude, a normal drone video would appear to be covering ground quickly, but as you can see, that wasn't happening. In fact, the wind was actually pushing the drone off course as it tried to go along the river up the stream. You can see this in the path record made by the drone software. For all that the effort involved, I probably should have just continued to fly up to the fork, but decided the conditions were not really conducive to it, and I was a little worried about losing the drone with all the wind, since it would have taken a good amount of battery power getting to that fork. If drones run out of battery, they have a habit of landing where they happen to be at the time. And while the controller software gives a good indication of where the drone happens to be at any given moment, a long cross-country walk to find it was not on my to-do list for that day. Yes, I'm a wuss, and it probably would have worked out. But I lost a drone last year while flying into a tree, so I am cautious about these things. In conclusion, I want to say that I was very impressed with this lovely little country village, and I can well understand Laurence Olivier's desire to have a country home here. If you happen to be visiting the Stenning area, this small spot in West Sussex is a recommended stop. This has been a production of A Yank in Sussex. If you've enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe or follow. Thanks for watching, and may you have a very nice day.